Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. Today, I am very, very happy to be joined by Kawa Hassan, who is a non-resident fellow with the Stimson's Middle East and North Africa program, and he comes with much other experience and credentials behind him, which we will explore in our conversation. Welcome to the Amargi, Kawa.
Thank you so much, Elif. Great, to talk to you, and thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Well, some of us, in a way, hoped that 2026 might be a smoother or calmer or more tranquil year. We may not have fully believed it, but we really hoped for it. But 2026 has already started, quite literally, quite explosively in many parts of the world. We won't be talking about it today, but of course, from, Latin America, Venezuela, to all the way to some of the events and on the ground realities that have unfolded in Aleppo, Syria. So, as some of our listeners may know, and of course, as you know, Aleppo has just come through its most tragic week, actually, since Assad's downfall. For 3 days, fighting tore through the predominantly Kurdish neighbourhoods of Sheikh Mahsud and Ashrafia, forcing, currently figures are around 140,000 people to flee their homes. And some reports are suggesting that at least 10 civilians were killed in the clashes. The escalating tensions erupted seemingly on Tuesday, the 6th of January, which led to its first clashes. And a lot of locals reported that the interim Syrian army forces cut off supplies of electricity, water, and food. And they have described what they lived through as living under a total siege. Sadly, some descriptions that we've been hearing a lot from different contexts for a few years. And recently, in the early hours of the 9th of January, a ceasefire was finally declared, bringing the active violence to a halt. Now, there's a lot that has happened, but I want to ask you, there was some of the reports around Syria's interim foreign minister abruptly ending a meeting. There's suggestions of how this was also with the influence or the intervention of the Turkish government. Can you tell us what went so catastrophically wrong here when some of the negotiations that have been happening for almost a year were positively at a turning point? What happened, and why do you think it happened?
Right. So you've got triggers, and then you've got structural factors, I would say, that have led to the current fightings. So first of all, as you said, and you haven't mentioned that, but I'm sure we will discuss that during our conversation. The March 10th agreement between Damascus and SDF was supposed, to be, they both sides said they seek to implement it, to be implemented by the end of last year. Obviously, that didn't happen. So I think, from my discussions with people who are familiar with the negotiations between both sides, but also, I interviewed a lot of people for my recent publication on the peace process in Turkey, PKK Turkish peace process. One of the takeaways I got was that a clash was somehow inevitable. The question was, where would that erupt and when? Why? Because we are talking about completely two different views about the implementation of the March 10th agreement. I think that's that's what needs a good conversation. On the one hand, integration into the new Syrian state of SDF, all the political military, institutions, and then recognition of Kurdish rights, right? So that didn't happen, obviously, and despite many negotiations between both sides. And I think the trigger, or maybe more than the trigger, for the current fighting in Aleppo is, in my view at least, I think probably the deal between Syria and Israel in Paris, brokered by the US. Probably that was, a key trigger. Why? Well, I mean, after months or a year of negotiations between both sides, finally it seems the US has managed to, push both sides to have at least common understandings. It's not an agreement. Even the statement calls about understandings. Intelligence sharing. And deconflicting between both sides. And basically, in effect, the new Syrian government accepting Israeli dominance in southern Syria and also in Jordan. So the Syrian government, obviously in coordination with Turkey, they wanted this fight in Aleppo first and foremost to divert attention, and that has been so far successful. Nobody's talking, at least, most of the people are not really talking about that deal because it has been it's so dramatic, for the position of the Syrian government, right? So divert attention from that, making concessions to an external power, at the same time oppressing a key internal component. And actually, this model of the new Syrian government fits within the overall approach of this new authority towards the different communities in Syria. By this, what I mean by this. So what we see is that every big event, or eruption of violent, confrontations between Syrian government and its allied, and its, groups, aligned groups, and be it Druze or in Swaida or Alawites in the coastal areas, or now Kurds, it's always been preceded by some external development where the regime gets, more support, international legitimacy, or reads what it thinks that they have a carte blanche, if you like, to oppress what they see as groups opposing to their drive to once again reunite Syria. So in this case, we cannot, in my view, at least the timing, really disconnect what happened in Aleppo from the Paris. So the Paris agreement between Syria and Israel, brokered by US, it's a big development. And obviously, through this deal, Syria accepts the new reality in southern Syria, right? And acknowledge the Israeli dominance. It has been formalized. It has been accepted, but now it has been formalized. So to drive attention, to divert attention from that, I think in coordination with Turkey, they decided it's time to move on. Now, so this brings me to the question, have Kurds been sacrificed, right? So I think...
Before we get to that, I want to ask you, so
Sure.
You said, which I think I want to explore that a bit more. You said that, with Turkey, they wanted to divert attention from the Paris agreement with Israel. So is this also suggesting, in your opinion, that Turkey is also accepting Israel's dominance in the south of Syria and in the Golan? Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because what it seemed like until recently is that there has been a major conflict or a tension of power between Israel and Turkey when it comes to Syria. Israel wanting to ensure that Turkey doesn't have dominance in Syria, even attacking some areas of Syria that would have been Turkish bases. They didn't actively attack, Turkish forces, but places that were in the talks of being designated as where Turkish bases would be formed, and also trying to ensuring that the interim government does not have particularly an air force. So are we seeing here also Turkey accepting Israel's dominance?
Yes, and grudgingly and indirectly. So I think Turkey, one of the new dynamics in Syria is, after the fall of Assad, is this Israeli-Turkish rivalry, and this would be quite decisive for the future trajectory of the Syrian transition. So obviously Israel opposes too much Turkish influence in Syria, and the same applies to Turkey, about Israel. But Turkey can't do much about the Israeli dominance in Syria. That is very clear. So what happened is that some people say even this is a very humiliating deal for Syria, and if you remember that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey met with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Syria while, on the sidelines of the discussions in Paris. So it gives you a clear idea. I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories. I never believe in conspiracy theories. I'm a political scientist and I'm a realist. So, but I think if you connect the dots, it's very, very clear that what we are seeing right now, particularly when it comes to the fighting in Aleppo, is an attempt to somehow kind of establish or somehow indirectly formalize the spheres of influence between Israel and Turkey inside Syria, right? So militarily, the Kurdish fighters, they are in a strategic bind in Aleppo, so they're in a very difficult position. In my view, most likely scenario is that at some point there will be a deal. And that I don't know how the deal would look like, but probably these fighters have to leave Aleppo, and then kind of an agreement should be in place whereby the population are protected. There's sufficient guarantees for the protection of civilians, but it will be difficult to go back to before the fighting. I think that's clear. So here, the Syrian government can sell this to its base, to supporters, as a win, right? Diverting attention from the deal with Israel, but also it serves the interest of Turkey because, again, Turkey is not happy with the deal, but there isn't much it can do about it. So I think US is also somehow providing space for Turkey indirectly, without green light, I think, of US, this fighting wouldn't happen in Aleppo. So, somehow, kind of consolidating what has been there by the consolidating spheres of influence between Turkey and Syria, the two most influential external actors in Syrian transition process, consolidating that with the support of Turkey. But as I said, Syrian Kurds right now in Aleppo are in a strategic bind, but this isn't by no means that Kurds' influence will be completely completely destroyed in Syria. So we can discuss that about what does this mean for the Maastricht agreement, the position of Kurds in future Syria, but also in the overall region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I wanted to also, because you mentioned something about, the fighters in Aleppo. So already, quite a few months ago, the SDF especially withdrew from these neighborhoods in SDF. So what has been remaining, which was an agreement, actually a formal agreement with the interim Syrian government, was local asayish, which, would be, to describe it in English, would be, local protection forces, where it's, people protecting their own neighborhoods, not not official soldiers of the SDF. So even with that reality, obviously they have gone into Aleppo, and there was even a compromise made from the let's call it broadly the Kurdish side, where there were a few agreed joint checkpoints where the interim government did not want their soldiers having to stand with women.
Right.
So the Kurdish side even made some concessions, right, to say, okay, well, in the joint checkpoints, we will ensure that there are no women having to stand. So some of these concessions were made, and they might not be very well known by people. And even though that has been made, unfortunately, it seems that there is a very classic narrative of equating essentially seemingly all Kurdish people as the SDF. And there's reports from the ground where a Syrian army soldier at the Al-Zuhur checkpoint, and also actually other journalists or so-called journalists like Samet Dagul, who is even wanted in Turkey for Al-Qaeda links, have claimed that the SDF are using civilians as human shields, seemingly to create or justify attacks on residential areas. Again, another narrative that we've seen, right? So can you tell us a bit about what some of those 10th of March agreements for the territorial integration of the Northeast entailed. You know, there was stuff that specifically concerned Aleppo, because obviously Aleppo is not in the northeast of Syria, but has
Mm,
historically, particularly two large Kurdish majority neighborhoods.
mm,
What did this agreement entail, and why is it such a blow that this happened considering that agreement? And I
mm.
do also want to talk a bit more about the detailed role of Turkey, but perhaps we can get to that in a second.
Right. Well, actually, I mean, the March 10th agreement itself, it didn't, specify, or didn't have any specific clauses about the situation in Aleppo. It was the April 1st agreement between SDF and the Syrian government, based on which they agreed that SDF would withdraw, Asaish, which means the local security force, will take over, right? And SDF withdrew all the heavy weapons. I mean, it was done in front of the media cameras, so journalists were there.
Yeah.
And I heard also about the compromises you mentioned that the SDF did to address some of the some of the concerns, if you like, of the other side. So there wasn't really any specific clauses about the future of these Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo. But point is that when the massacres in the coastal areas occurred and when atrocities were committed in Sweden, this was a really turning point in the view of Kurds, but also others who don't agree with the jihadi fundamentalist vision of the new rulers in Damascus. That these, maybe al-Shara himself is a pragmatic politician. Maybe he's ready to some sort of accommodation. But the roots of the movement and those groups align with it, they don't believe in any power sharing. Not only that, they want to substitute Assad, regime authoritarianism with a new authoritarianism. So what happened is that, going back to the March 10th agreement, 3 days after the March 10th agreement, what happened? Al-Shara came with a constitutional decree which gives him way more power than Assad had. Can you imagine? 3 days after the March 10th agreement, without any consultation with SDF or whoever, other groups in Syria. So what happened is that I think the massacres in Sweden, in coastal area, and the atrocities in Sweden convinced not only, by the way, SDF, other Kurds. I spoke to them, those who absolutely don't agree with the views of the local administration, the autonomous administration or SDF. They don't share their views, their political views. They came to conclude that this is about survival. This is an existential struggle. This is not only about trying to reach an agreement about certain rights. No, this is about our very much being there. So I think you could see that the positions were really hard, also within the Kurdish communities, that it is the SDF weapons that is protecting us. Had it not been for SDF, we could have faced the same fate of Alawites and Druze in Sweden. So I mean, this is really an important turning point, in the Kurdish community in Syria. And now I think this position will be even way more, will be hardened even more after what they have seen in Aleppo. So, going forward, I think it's important, to focus on going forward. What could happen, in the coming, I don't know, days and weeks. Obviously, from a military point of view, the Asaish, the local security forces, the Kurdish fighters there, I don't see they have any, the odds of them, obviously, win this fight is almost nil, is zero. So they say they will fight, and they are fighting still. But I think at some point, in my view, it makes sense to reach a deal with Damascus, brokered by the US and France. And if SDF manages to get security guarantees for the protection of the not only Kurds, other groups, because it's not only Kurds who live in these neighborhoods. Yes, it's majority are Kurds, but it's not only Kurds. You are talking about about Christians. You are talking about Yazidis and other groups, right? What is needed? Clear-cut, enforced security guarantees for the civilians, and then having a local police force that is trusted by the community. Anything short of that, I think maybe the government may succeed in its effort to, win this round of war, but this round of the fighting, but that would be a Pyrrhic victory, and it will backfire.
I mean, as you've just described, I think what I'm hearing is, others have said this too, but what I'm hearing from you as well is that, you know, what has happened, particularly in Aleppo, but in the last year since the fall of Assad and all the developments, of course, it's not just about, and, even with what's happened in Aleppo, it's not just a Kurdish issue here. It's about the future of Syria and what that looks like. And, you have also been an advocate of a decentralized Syria, or at least one where there is some levels of kind of autonomy for different groups. There's obviously been others who have really argued against that, putting forward the kind of like balkanization argument, and I think there's a lot to talk about there. But what I also want to come to is, as we touched on earlier on in our conversation, one of the loudest voices and actors since the fall of Assad, and actually even before in many ways, in the case of Syria, has been Israel. And if we just go back to that for a second, mainly because, there was a lot of people who, there was a lot of people who said the opposite too, but there was a lot of people who saw the involvement, let's say it for the sake of argument, of Israel in Syria as in some way supportive of the Kurdish people. Now, if what has happened in Aleppo followed some sort of agreement between Syria and Israel in Paris, does that mean Israel has also sacrificed the Kurds for its own broader regional ambitions?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to highlight that there hasn't been any agreement between Kurds and Israel, and that Israel has broken that agreement. So that is not the case. So what we have seen is that there has been some rhetorical support from Israel or Israeli politicians or journalists for Kurds in Syria and Iraq, rhetorical support, not more than that. And Kurds know this reality very well. Kurds in Syria, they depend on themselves when it comes to the protection of the, of Northeast, of areas which are under their control. And Kurds, they were instrumental in the fight against ISIS. They themselves, because they fought that group, the terrorist group with the support of US, obviously, and so I think, in my view, is we cannot speak of an Israeli, betrayal of Kurds, since there was no agreement whatsoever between them. And so I see it a bit more differently. What I'm trying to say is that in the case of Druze, clear cut, that area south of Syria, where Druze live in Sweden, that is part of the Israeli sphere of influence, period, right? And because you've got Druze in Israel, and, they have very strong connections with the Druze in Sweden, they were, an important factor to push Netanyahu government, and try to make sure that there are guarantees for the position of Druze. When it comes to Kurds, some Kurds may be disappointed in the Israeli policy, but I would say it's important for Kurds to first and foremost depend on themselves. Kurds have agency, they have political agency, they have social agency, they even have some military agency, and we can talk about that later on. So I don't think it would be helpful for Kurds to say, Israel betrayed us. Don't depend on them. Depend on yourself. Put your house in order. Have a doctrine, a military doctrine to defend your areas. So what the Kurds need to do is, first of all, particularly in Syria, they need, and they are doing that, self-protection of the areas where they are, they have the majority, plus soft power. And Kurdish soft power in the next stage will be crucial. So this is what I can say about the Israeli factor, if you like.
So, I mean, in terms of depending on oneself, one of the discussions, and you've explored this in your latest publication as well, one of the discussions, or the kind of suggestions that have been that have been floating around for a while, has been a possible meeting between the commander-in-chief of the SDF, Mazlum Abdi, and Öcalan in
Mm.
Turkey to partly complement the March 10th agreement, which I suppose now, and I'd like to hear, like, is that fully up in the air? Is there a way to come back to that? But also as a way to also support, as you've also said in your latest publication, the interconnectedness of the process in Syria and between the Turkish state and the PKK. What can that look like now? Is that even possible now after Aleppo, a meeting between these two figures? If it is possible, what will that meeting entail now, do you think?
Well, first of all, Elif, politics is the art of possible. And in the current world order, where everything is upside down, the political common sense is upside down. So what we took for granted for the past 50, 60 years, they have, all actually, are collapsing. So what might seem impossible right now, probably in 2, 3 months' time or 3 years, may be possible. So we cannot disregard that, that possibility at all. But I think for now, given the fighting in Aleppo, probably that would definitely have an impact on the negotiation between PKK and Turkey. I can't imagine otherwise. While you have this fighting in Aleppo, and by the way, the fighting hasn't ended yet, so we don't know how this will evolve in the coming hours and days. Once the fighting is over, how the Syrian government will deal with the Kurds in Aleppo, what would be the kind of deal that would emerge about relations between SDF and Damascus. So that's all up in the air. We don't know yet. But as I wrote in my piece, Turkey has a historic, unique opportunity to start a slow process of addressing the Kurdish issue now, before it's too late. And now, I say now before it's too late, Öcalan once again has emerged, and this is by I have spoken to Turkish experts, officials, and they recognize this, that despite their differences with him, he is the only one who can manage to push this process through from the Kurdish side. And he is 77. And I think if Turkish government would really take serious steps, first, amnesty law for PKK fighters, and having a deal about the fate of the PKK leaders, and then gradually, extending rights to Kurds in Turkey. That would be first and foremost in the interest of Turkey itself. It's a strategic interest for Turkey, as it is a strategic interest for Kurds. Because then Turkey would prepare itself for the big transformations which will come our way in the coming years in Middle East. And we haven't yet spoken about the situation in Iran and how that might develop, So the situation in Middle East is changing very rapidly, and Turkey could become a very important strategic player, way more important than it is right now, if it has reached a historic agreement with Kurds. And that would have a positive impact on the Kurdish issue in Syria. Turkey could be a mediator in the negotiations between SDF and Damascus, rather than being part of the war. It could it could play that role and win over the Kurds in Syria, So even with all this, the current grim situation in Aleppo, I am not all too pessimistic. If you go back to 20, 25 years ago, initially Turkey didn't want to have any formal relations with Kurdistan region in Iraq, right? So things have changed, dynamics have changed, and right now, the relations are reasonably good, and it's actually for the interest of both sides. Both sides have benefited from it, right? So I think for now, that possible option of Mazlum Abdi traveling to Turkey and meeting with Öcalan in his prison may seem quite distant, but who knows, right? And so going back to your question about the connectivity between the peace process or the situation in Syria and the situation in Turkey, very well interconnected, and we just have to wait and see how the fighting and the aftermath of the fighting and the deal that would emerge may impact the peace process in Turkey. We don't know yet.
I mean, I think what you said is really important in how, strategic, but particularly a possible peace process between the Turkish state and the PKK is seen. I mean, it seems that both parties agree that it's a very strategic process. Where the disagreement seems, and this is, I want to hear your thoughts about this, is, the Turkish state still fundamentally is approaching or sees, in its own words, particularly when you hear the words of Devlet Bahçeli and even President Erdogan, that seeing the Kurdish issue as essentially a security matter. They've described this process as a terror-free Turkey, where the Kurdish movement and Öcalan have described it and continue to describe it as a matter of the democratization of Turkey. Do you think the process, it's possible for the process to progress while both sides see they analyze the actual reality or the situation in fundamentally different ways?
Excellent question, and I wrote about this in my latest publication, and I think it's an excellent question. So some people, most of the people may be surprised by what I'm going to say. I say, despite these two opposing narratives, there is still a possibility that things could move forward in Turkey. Why? So if, by the way, during negotiations between two parties, both parties retaining their narrative is not something unique to Turkey and PKK. We have seen this in other parts of the world where there were negotiations between armed groups and states, or even between states, that they retain their narratives because narratives matter, because they are needed to connect with your base, social and political base. So while Turkey talks about a Turkey-free, a Turkey-free terror, if I'm not mistaken, and then, PKK and Öcalan talking about that, a peaceful and democratic society. Yes, definitely, they are diametrically opposed to each other. But at the same time, even despite that, there is a possibility for some progress. And why? Because to me, while the narrative is important in terms of connection with your base, what matters is what happens on the ground. Right? So you could still, and this is something very normal in politics, you could still have your own narrative, but on the ground, things may move, yes, slowly, but things still could move, right? So, for instance, now that it has been delayed, the steps that needs to be taken by Turkey in terms of the amnesty law, unfortunately, it has been delayed. But there has been some very interesting developments in Turkey over the past year, which were inconceivable 2 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, right? So, for instance, Devlet Bahçeli, he is the initiator of this process, right? So we all know the background of Devlet Bahçeli. That's one. Second, for the first time, a cross-party commission from the parliament met with Öcalan, right? Again, I think interesting development. The steps taken by PKK, burning weapons, withdrawing fighters from Turkey to Iraqi Kurdistan, and some other steps. So what I see is that I call this two narratives, one process. You've got these two opposing narratives, but at the same time, the process on the ground was really moving slowly, at times with some setbacks, but still it was moving. And it's still not too late, to kind of, kickstart the process. But again, I think the fighting in Aleppo probably will slow down the process or derail it for a while. But my hope, and this is a hope, and I hope that I don't know that Turkey will see the strategic importance of this process for preparing Turkey for post-October 7, Middle East security and political structure, and also being a geopolitical actor by being inclusive inside Turkey.
I mean, I have so many more questions to ask you, but I think one of the important ones that I'm sure our listeners will really want to hear your thoughts on is, as someone who, of course, Al-Shara was in Paris for the talks that we've already explored, but at the same time, he later met with EU leaders. And as someone who's based in the heart of Europe, what do you think? What do you think, particularly European leaders and EU leaders, specifically the European Union leaders, what is their thinking when it comes to Syria?
Mm.
They, of course, know the reality. They've seen what happened in the
Sure.
coastal areas. They've seen what's
Sure.
happened in Sueda. Of course, they must know what's happened in Aleppo in the last few days. What is this effort to? Why still the legitimization of Ahmed al-Shara? Why still these meetings? Tell us about what you think the thinking of both European leaders and European Union leaders are in this situation.
Yeah. Well, the thinking is that they, if you talk to them, they say we have to deal with the reality as it is, which means you've got a new government in Damascus, led by Ahmed al-Shara, previously Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. We have to, acknowledge this reality, and that's true. Yes, definitely. But the way they have been approaching the transition process, in my view, is extremely short-sighted. It damages the long-term interests of EU and member states in Syria. And why it's extremely short-sighted? Because it's very narrowly focused on the issue of repatriating Syrian refugees and pushing back, Iranian influence, particularly is the US, which is engaged in this, and Israel, right? And, hopefully at some point start with reconstruction of Syria without any meaningful engagement and pressure on an inclusive political process. In my view, this is a strategic mistake committed and still being committed by EU and by member states. And as you rightly said, I think it was yesterday, the president of the European Commission and the president of the European Council met with Shara. It's absolutely fine they meet with them, but they should be more forceful in condemning human rights violations, calling for inclusive political process, forcefully calling for it, being vocal about it, because what's going on right now, the massacres in coastal areas, the atrocities in Sueda, and what's going on right now in Aleppo, and God knows what will happen in the coming weeks and months, this will not bring stability to Syria. If anything, it will only build, it will only set the stage for an, further fragmentation of Syria, further division of Syria, more refugees towards Europe, and we haven't spoken about it, strengthening of ISIS and groups, like-minded groups of ISIS. So yes, I would say absolutely they should engage in, Ahmed al-Shara, but they should be very clear on the need for an inclusive political process, for an inclusive national Syrian army, and that, in my view, currently Syria is deeply divided. The only way to reunite Syria is through one of two options: decentralization or massacres. There is no third option, right? I can't conceive how the current government can impose its will on the entirety of the Syria if it's not inclusive, if it doesn't take, if it's not really, if it's, if it doesn't try to address the security political concerns of different components. The only way to do it is just through violence. And we all know that you could gain some tactical gains by using violence and by making concessions to external powers like Israel and gaining more and more international legitimacy. But no amount of external legitimacy can make up for internal legitimacy. And that is the fundamental problem of the current transition process in Syria. And that is where I think Europe and other powers and regional states, by the way, are committing a strategic mistake, because they should engage, but they should be more conditional, and they should be more forceful in their calls and actions for the need for a true inclusive political process. Otherwise, Syria will never be reunited. And even if the government would manage to reunite the country, it will be through massacres, atrocities, and Syria will remain a failed state. And a failed Syrian state in Middle East will be once again a black hole that will, really absorb the entire region with it.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and your time, Kawa Hassan. I'm sure we will have many more conversations because, as you've said, there's so much we didn't have the time to touch on. But thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. It's so appreciated.
Thank you so much, Elif. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for your critical questions.
Thank you very much. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.